I've really become interested in the idea that the sense of engagement, of meaningful engagement, is the deepest of cognitive instincts. I actually think you can make a very strong neurobiological case for that. And that if you're engaged in something, what it means is that you're safe and secure, on the one hand, sufficiently safe and secure. You're in your domain of competence, which is a good place to be. It's like explored territory. So you're within the walls where you're safe, but you're also peering over the fence at the same time, right? So if you're engaged, what it means is that you're in your domain of competence, but you're operating within that domain of competence so that you're expanding your competence at the same time. And so you feel that as meaningfully engaging, and it is. And so, and I do also think that that sense of meaningful engagement is the right antidote to the suffering that's part and parcel of our limited existence. It's like you need an antidote to the fact that life is suffering. And the experience of meaningful engagement, I think, is that antidote. And I also think that the experience of meaningful engagement is a marker that you're where you should be, doing what you should be at the right time. I think it's the deepest of cognitive instincts. And so that's really cool, man, if that was true. I think it's actually true. If I'm in the zone properly, it's ridiculously fascinating. Because people are ridiculously interesting. And so, and everyone has their own characteristic experience that's actually unique. And so if you have a real conversation with someone and they tell you what's unique about their experience, the probability that you can learn something from that is, it's certain that you can. I've been using the term dominance hierarchy a lot, which it's something that's used by biologists very regularly, right? Because most social animals, even animals that aren't social, any animals that have to compete for occupation of a specific territorial space tend to organize themselves into fairly predictable hierarchies. And it's a biological universal. That's a good way of thinking about it, which is something really important to know, right? Because if you don't know that, then you might think that hierarchical organizations are some secondary consequence of a socio-political structure or an economic structure or something like that. And that's just not true. It isn't even a little bit true. It's unbelievably not true. If you look at career choices between men and women, what you find is that they're driven in large part by temperamental differences. So that would be in the big five: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And also by interest, because the biggest difference between men and women that's been measured psychometrically, forget about the physical differences, but the psychological differences, is difference in interest. And it's actually pretty big. And so men, on average, are more interested in things, and women, on average, are more interested in people. And it's a 1 standard deviation difference, which is a big difference by the standards of these sorts of differences. It's extraordinarily reliable. It is, as far as I'm concerned, apart from the hard biological end of psychology, where there's some unbelievably solid work done, it's the most solid social science that exists, as far as I can tell, the psychometric data. And the reason I think that is when I was starting my career, I was looking for the most solid data, because one of the things I wanted to do was learn how to predict how people's lives transformed and changed and across time, and what sort of level of achievement they managed. So I was looking for the most reliable and valid measures. And it's clearly the psychometric measures are the most reliable and valid. Period. No one disputes that. Well, there are a variety of features that predict economic success in the Western world. The most outstanding of those are IQ, so that's straight intelligence, and intelligence is something like processing speed and working memory capacity. So it's the ability to manipulate variables, a number of variables simultaneously at relatively high speeds. And they're abstract variables. And the armed forces concluded that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything you could possibly be trained to do in the military at any level of the organization that wasn't positively counterproductive. Okay, you think, well, so what? 83, okay. Yeah, 1 in 10. 1 in 10. That's 1 in 10 people. And what that really means, that as far as I can tell, is if you imagine that the military is approximately as complex as the broader society, which I think is a reasonable proposition, then there's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. The best way to sum up a conscientious person is that they're very good at keeping contracts with themselves and others. So what a conscientious person will do is, first of all, say that they'll do something. So that's the first thing. But then they'll actually do it. you'd hope if a system is functioning that faster, harder working people would be better at whatever it does. And it turns out that in our culture, in the Western culture, the correlation between conscientiousness plus IQ, you have to weight the two, and long-term life success is as high as 0.7, which is walloping correlation. Ineradicability of inequality. So part of the problem with this process that we just described, where success breeds success and failure breeds failure, is that the people who are succeeding get a disproportionate share of the resource pie, let's say. So the same rule applies to number of records sold by recording artists. The same rule applies to number of books sold by novelists. The same rule applies to number of goals scored by NHL hockey players. The same rule applies to the population of cities and the mass of stars and the size of trees in the jungle. It's like the inequality problem is way more troublesome, again, than mere capitalism. It's a terrible problem. Well, let's say you find a Neolithic burial site and there's 200 people in it. So these people would be buried with their possessions. And obviously some of them decay, but some of them don't. And like some of them are buried with gold. Well, hardly any of them. And the tiny proportion of people who are buried with gold are buried with a lot of gold. Well, even in hunter-gatherer societies where there's no surplus, there's still inequality, because there's inequality of friendship, there's inequality of health, and there's inequality of sexual access. And those things they are not trivial. But when you're thinking about it purely economically, you start to get inequality as soon as you get a surplus. You think, oh, that's interesting. So there's a natural rule, which is surplus generates inequality. All right, so how do you solve that? And Scheidel's book says, well, that's easy. You just get rid of the surplus. Right, and that's not good. The thing is that a meritocracy will drive inequality. And then you have a problem because people stack up at zero, and they can't get out of zero. Because that's what happens as inequality increases. People think about when you're playing Monopoly, the game. I mean, that's a perfect example of how inequality emerges. Everybody's equal to begin with. Everybody basically plays a random game, because Monopoly is basically a random game. I mean, there's some skill in it, but not much. So it's a random game. So what happens when everyone starts equal and you play a random game? One person ends up with everything. Everyone else stacks up at zero. Now, Scheidel's book basically shows the only way out of that is various forms of war, including revolution, and epidemics. That's it. That's the only thing he's been able to track. And what happens is, well, you level everyone, and then inequality decreases. It's like, well, okay. Like, that doesn't seem like a really great solution. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, that people of disproportionate intelligence shouldn't be rewarded disproportionately. It's possible that they should, because it might be in the best interest of everyone else to dump as much money as possible to the top 2% of the cognitive strata, because they're going to be most generative with it. It's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy so that things don't destabilize. I would say that the long-term solution, assuming that there is one, to the problem of inequality is that people who are disproportionately fortunate, let's say, or successful, or both, take the moral duty of doing the best possible good that they can with the money that they generate.
Correct.
But the other thing I think that's sort of interesting about that is I actually don't think there's anything more interesting to do with your money than
Correct.
that. It's like, can you think of anything more interesting to do with your money than to find a really difficult problem that causes a bunch of people suffering and then try to fix it? It's like,
it's amazing.
If you have a clue, that's got to be a little better than a third yacht. Competence, a good measure of competence would be the ability to work within the hierarchy while you're also maintaining it and expanding it. And so that means that you would want to set up an economic system where smart, hardworking people were doing things that made other people who weren't them rich too. And I think we're actually pretty good at that. And then the person who's a little more generous than reciprocal, 50-50 would be reciprocal, maybe you should err on the side of generosity. Why? Well, easy. People will line up to play with you. So then the question is, do you want to win the game or do you want to win the set of games? Right. And I think there's rules that govern the set of all possible games. And it's the rules that govern the set of all possible games that constitute something like an emergent ethic. So anyway, so that's a very useful thing to know. It's a very useful thing to know. Panksepp discovered the play circuitry in mammals. And that's also a big deal, right? That's like discovering a continent. And to discover a dedicated circuitry to a set of complex biological functions, that's a big deal, man. You pair these rats together, and what you find is that, so the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, and the big rat will, like, you know, break his cool and then wrestle. And then if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will no longer ask him to play. Like, and I read that, it was like, little electrical storm went off in my brain.
That is what happened to me too.
Well, it's so good, so absolutely unbelievable. Is that, well, there you have it, it's emergent ethic of reciprocity. That ethic emerged at the biological level, and then human beings watched it develop and told stories about it. That's where the stories came from. And then out of the stories, we coded an explicit ethic. And that's where the philosophy of ethics came from. But it emerged from the bottom up. The UN set as one of its millennial goals in the year 2000 to have the rates of poverty in the world by 50% within 15 years, right? And we hit that in 2012, 3 years ahead of schedule. It was the fastest decrease in human poverty that has ever occurred in the history of the planet by a massive margin. And it hasn't quit. Now, obesity is a bigger problem now than starvation. It's like, we should have party in the street for that, right? There's more fat people than there are starving people. You know, it's a perverse sort of victory, but it's a big one. And about 300,000 people a day right now are being plugged into the electrical grid, and the fastest growing economies are in sub-Saharan Africa. It's like, there's some real reason to be thinking things are going great. It's like asking whether you can reduce consciousness to its material substrate. And the answer to that is yes. But by the time we reduce consciousness to its material substrate, our understanding of what that material substrate is will have transformed so dramatically that it won't look very much like the material substrate that we presume now. And so if we're in a simulation, then it's within the confines of a mechanism that we can't easily assimilate to our own computational devices.